Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at using the MyLittleGrid custom grid and SQL Tools add-ons with SQL Server to speed up your application development. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have a PowerBasic Windows application with a MyLittleGrid on the single form. The definition and position of each of the columns in this grid comes not from the application itself, but from a configuration table inside SQL Server. This can be manipulated and adjusted using our configuration utility. This defines the name of each column as it will appear in the grid, the name of each column as it comes out of the SQL Server database, and other details like the column width, whether the column is actually locked. So what we're going to do today is to populate this grid with as little code as possible in our application. So first of all, we needed some data into the database. This is our SQL Server database. I created a user list table with a list of users which we're going to display inside this grid. I'll be covering the mechanism by which we generate this data in a later video. But for the moment, we have a table called table user list, which contains all the data we need. I've also created a store procedure whose job it is to return all the data within that table. This is a store procedure doing a very simple select with no conditions from the table, selecting every column within the table. So how can we quite easily return all that information inside the grid? If we have a look at the callback function, the event handler for the form itself, and go into the initialization handler at the top of the callback function. This is where we're going to define the mechanism by which the grid on our initial form will be pre-populated before it's shown with all the data in our user list table. As you'll remember, when we showed the form initially, we defined the column names in the grid and we set a few variables up. Well, we're going to reuse these. So we copy this and go back into our event handler, and we'll paste this up at the top. There are three variables defined here: the form name, the grid name, and the tab name. Now I'm going to make these static variables rather than locals, and we're going to populate them inside the initialization handler. This is because once these are populated, I want to store this information so that every time this particular function is called, this information is available. These three variables hold the form name, grid name, and tab name, which are defined in the configuration utility. Form, grid, and tab. So we will also declare a local variable to hold our SQL string. And our SQL string will contain an execute command to execute our store procedure. So far so good. Now all we have to do is to populate the grid. We've already written a generic function to query a SQL Server database and return the result set in an array. Now MyLittleGrid already has functions that will take an array and put them straight into a form. So we've expanded on that very slightly so that it's driven entirely by the definition within the SQL Server database for the form. We have a new function, generic populate grid. This takes a number of parameters, firstly the form name, the grid name, and the tab name. Then it takes the SQL Server we're going to be executing, which is this one here. It takes the handle to the grid, ours is grid number 1, and it takes the handle to the database. This new function is held within our new library. That's our form grid tab resource library. This defines how the configuration of the grid is held in the SQL Server database. So with a single line of code, we can quite simply run the application now and populate our grid. And there is our grid populated, with remarkably little code within our application. Now, as you'll see here, we're displaying a number of columns. The ID column, the forename and surname, the job title, the department, and a tick box for active. Each of these fields at the moment is locked, so they're all read-only. Since in our SQL Server we're returning all the columns in the table, we can quite easily add an extra column to the table without changing our application at all. If we have a look at the SQL Server, we'll see that one other piece of information we're returning is the name of the city. So if we take the name of the city and we go back to our configuration utility, and if we want the city name to appear in here, and we will unhide it, we will leave it centered, and we will save that back to the database. Now we haven't changed our application, we've merely changed the data held for the configuration of the grid inside SQL Server. So if we run our application again, we'll see that the city has now been added as the last column. This gives you a great deal of flexibility. If our users of the application want the job title highlighted in some way, we can quite easily do that again without changing the code. If we go back into our configuration, locate the job title, and rather than the default color black, we'll mark this one in blue. Save that back to the database, back to the application again, run it once more, and we'll see that the job title is now highlighted in blue. Now if the user wishes again to change the position of any of the columns, that's just a simple matter of reordering them in the configuration utility. If we want to move the job title to the right of the department and keep the department beside the surname, we merely have to change the numbers in our configuration utility. So our job title is column 4 and the department's column 5. Simply saving these, going back to application again, running this, and there we now have the department beside the surname and the job title shifted one column to the right. So using this configuration in the SQL Server database gives you a great deal of flexibility. What we'll show in the next video is once we actually move these around, we don't have to change the code in the application. Inside your application, all your references to columns will be by the result name, which is the name as it comes back from SQL Server. The user gets to see the column name, but we refer in code to the result name. Using this mechanism, it means we can move the columns around as much as we like, and the code within the application will not have to be amended to change column numbers, because it's driven entirely by the result name heading, which is held in the SQL Server database. But we'll leave that for the next video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.